Hi everybody. Before we hop on to the hardcore postulates and rules of English grammar, we need to clarify a couple of more. You should know few concepts before proceeding with the hardcore grammar. For example, you should be aware of what is a phrase, clause, subject, predicate, object, and a few more. In this video, we'll be discussing about phrase and clause. I have created other videos for a better understanding of subject predicate and subject object. So you can go through those videos also. So without further ado, let's start with phrase and clause. A phrase is a group of words that makes sense but not complete sense. A phrase does not have a subject verb relation. So what do you understand by phrase? A phrase will definitely not have a verb, and sometimes it will not have a subject also, and will not make complete sense at some time. For example, in a corner, running down the street after going to Japan. So you see, in a couple of them you can find verbs, but in none of them you can find a subject. Well, in order to understand what is subject, you need to go through the video on subject, subject predicate, and subject object. In these examples, you can see that few of them are making some sense. In a corner. What is in a corner? What is going on in a corner? It just mentions in a corner. In the next sentence, you can see running down the street. Well, it does make some sense. Running down the street, that means something is running down the street, but what is running, how it is running. So this is kind of incomplete, does not make complete sense. Let's move on to the next definition, a clause. A clause, on the other hand, refers to a group of words that has a subject-verb relationship. That is, a clause will definitely have a subject and a verb, but it need not have a complete meaning. So it can have a complete meaning, it may not have a complete meaning also, depending on what kind of a clause it is. Clause can be further categorized independent clause and dependent clause. We'll shortly see that their definitions as well. Let's see a few examples here. Kathy has slept. Here it has a subject, it has a complete verb, and it makes complete sense. Kathy has slept. Who has slept? Kathy has slept. I will go to Japan. This also makes a complete sense. I teach English. This is also a complete sentence. Let's see the next sentence. Because she is very beautiful. Well, this sounds a little awkward, as well as does not give us complete meaning of the sentence. You feel as if something is missing in this sentence. Because she is very beautiful. So it is answering to a particular question, but it needs to have something attached before it or after it. So this will fall into the category of dependent clause. We'll shortly see this in detail. Since we are discussing phrases and clauses, let me give you the definition of a sentence as well. So let's understand what is a sentence. A sentence will always have a subject, a verb, and will always make a complete sense. It will convey a proper meaning to the sentence. However, sentences can be also further categorized into simple, compound, and complex. I'll not discuss the definitions and the meaning and the differences between these three right now here. I'll go in depth about these kinds of sentences at the end of this video, because you need to understand what is a dependent clause and an independent clause in order to understand compound and complex sentences. So let's try to understand what do you mean by a dependent clause and an independent clause. Clauses can be dependent, or also called subordinate, or independent clause, also called main clause. An independent clause or the main clause expresses a complete thought. It can stand on its own without any additional information. So it is also a complete sentence. So please make a note. An independent clause, that is the main clause, will always make complete sense. For example, Akbar was a great king. Well, it definitely gives us a complete meaning. That who was a great king? Akbar was a great king. In the next sentence also, Sheldon is an adorable boy. This also makes a complete sentence. Now look at the definition of a dependent clause. So you may write down also, a dependent or a subordinate clause fails to express a complete thought. It cannot stand on its own and requires more information to complete. For example, who lived in Delhi? It does not give us a complete sense. You feel that as if something is missing in front of it or at the end of it. Similarly, because he respects everyone. So who is respecting? Why is he respecting? Nothing is being mentioned here. It seems that something is missing. If we combine a dependent clause with an independent clause, it will make a better sense. Let's analyze how. Akbar, who lived in Delhi, was a great king. So here, who lived in Delhi is the dependent clause, and Akbar was a great king is the independent clause. In totality, it makes a lot more sense. Akbar, who lived in Delhi, was a great king. Similarly, let's look at the next example. Sheldon is an adorable boy because he respects everyone. So in this case also, if you see, Sheldon is an adorable boy is an independent clause. Because he respects everyone is the dependent clause. And when we club them, it always gives a complete sense. So let's analyze a few more examples and try to see if you can distinguish between a dependent clause and an independent clause. Next sentence, we decided that she was not a friend of ours. So in this case, we decided that she was not a friend of ours. Here you can see that we decided is the independent clause and that she was not a friend of ours is the dependent clause. In the next sentence, the police came after the burglars had left. Similarly, in this case, the police came is the independent clause. After the burglars had left is the dependent clause. Although there were enough instruments to go around, their quality was poor. In this case, as you can see, the dependent clause is coming in the beginning of the sentence and the independent clause is coming at the end. So here you have an independent clause. The second text in the bold is independent clause and the first one is dependent clause. In the next sentence, unless Tom works hard, he will not clear the exam. So in this case, unless Tom works hard is the dependent clause. He will not clear the exam is the independent clause. Kalpana Chawla, who lived in Karnal, joined NASA in 1988. This is similar to the first example, Akbar. Here you can see Kalpana Chawla joined NASA in 1988. So this is behaving as an independent clause. Who lived in Karnal is behaving as a dependent clause and giving an additional meaning about Kalpana Chawla. So if you see, there is a particular difference between a dependent and an independent clause. There is something at the tip of the dependent clause. For example, that, after, although, unless, who. This is actually differentiating between the dependent and the independent clause. We will shortly see what are these called. You can make a note or two. No matter how many DCs we join, we will never get a complete sentence. So if you keep adding DC, a dependent clause, then another dependent clause, then another dependent clause, and you'll never be able to make a complete sense out of it. We require at least one IC. One IC must be there. That is, it must have a subject and a verb relation to make a complete sentence. And then you can add DC here, you can add a DC here, and you can make a complete sentence. I hope it's clear. Now we'll try to understand what are these called. That, after, although, unless, who. Let's see. The words that we saw at the tip of the dependent clause are called a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. You can make a note. A subordinate clause generally begins with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. What are subordinate conjunctions and relative pronouns? You can take down these examples. Subordinate conjunctions are after, because, if, that, though, although, till, until, before, unless, when, where, while, even, since, whereby, once, etc. Relative pronouns are that, which, who, whom, whose, etc. Let's go and analyze a little more. So you can write the definition. A subordinating conjunction is placed at the tip of an IC, that is an independent clause, to convert it into a DC. For example, she is beautiful. This is an IC and it makes complete sense. It has a subject, it has a verb, and it makes complete sense. But if we add a subordinating conjunction like because, it becomes a dependent clause. Because she is beautiful. So it does not make a complete sense here. A relative pronoun is a pronoun that introduces an adjectival DC. We'll discuss with example shortly. What do you mean by an adjectival DC? And it refers back to the immediately preceding noun. Always. It may become the subject of the previous clause also. For example, the umbrella that has been stolen is mine. So you see, the adjectival clause that is referring to umbrella, and this is our dependent clause. You can part it in two different clauses. The umbrella is mine. This is an independent clause. That has been stolen is a DC, a dependent clause which demands something more. And in this case, it is an adjectival DC. What is it? An adjectival DC. The adjectival DC is introduced by that here. Similarly, in the next sentence, the umbrella that I purchased has been stolen. Similarly, you can see that umbrella has been stolen is the independent clause. That I purchased is the dependent clause, which has been introduced by that, an adjectival dependent clause. I hope this is clear to you. What do you mean by a subordinating conjunction, relative pronoun, and how they can change an independent clause to a dependent clause. Now that we have gone through the definitions of clause, phrases, independent clause, dependent clause, subordinating conjunction, relative pronoun, we are ready to understand what do we mean by a simple sentence, a compound sentence, and a complex sentence. A simple sentence will have one subject and one finite verb. A compound sentence will have more than two independent clause. Please note it down. It will have more than two independent clause joined by a coordinating conjunction. Now, what are coordinating conjunctions? Coordinating conjunctions are conjunctions such as and, or, but. I'll give you the list of coordinating conjunctions afterwards. Now we move on to the complex sentences. A complex sentence will have one independent clause and greater than or equal to one dependent clause. These two clauses are joined by subordinating conjunctions. So we have already gone through the list of subordinating conjunctions. Conjunctions like although, until, when. So hope it is clear to you what are three different kinds of sentences and what are their meanings and how they are formed. We'll conclude this video here. You need to go through the other videos on subject predicate and subject object. Thank you very much.